Hello everybody, welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello.
Now, man came to me before we stepped in the studio and said, I've got some things to say, so I have no idea what the man's going to say, but he said he's got some important things to lay down.
Well, I want to pose a question to you and the viewers at home, because I have played a lot of games over the past year, more than I usually do, and I am starting to think that video game stories are getting worse. And I mean that purely in the space of, your AAA blockbusters, not your indies, and there are some exceptions in that space that we'll get to later on, obviously a lot of the output that Sony creates. But I was thinking about the games I played this year, whether it's Metro Exodus, Anthem, Control, Gears 5, more that I wrote down and can't remember now. But a lot of them, I have just come away feeling a little disappointed when it comes to the story, and I feel like I want to get to my main point, which is that these games, to me, are emblematic of a shift away in storytelling in this space. Because when it comes to these titles, Control especially, which I got through a few weeks ago, and we've been playing in the office and stuff, when it comes to these games, I'm really interested in the lore and the characters and the world, and I feel like they're so well drawn and so interesting. And when it came to Control, I was scavenging every single room to find each document and reading through it. I must have read more things in that game than I did actual
I've read more
shooting.
Control than I've read books.
I've read more Control than I've read books.
Yeah.
Because I was so interested in it. But the actual storyline of that game left a lot to be desired and ends abruptly and doesn't, for me, fulfill the potential of those ideas at the heart of it. So what I want to pose to you is, are we moving towards an era where mythology and lore is taking precedent over storytelling and narrative? What do you think?
Well, see, so when you initially when you said that before, that made me think of, obviously, like I said, I defaulted to God of War, Red Dead 2, things like, in the indie space, like Celeste or Katana Zero, or we've had the whole influx of walking simulators along this generation, but it's weird because the actual facility of a story, the actual function of a story in a AAA game, a lot of the more sort of corporately minded approaches to video games, the games as a platform or open world gaming or whatever, sort of DLC practices and stretching a game out for an entire year, a story isn't really conducive to those games, especially when arcade mentalities are more prevalent, where we're just trying to find a set of mechanics that we can just plug into and play over and over again, like your Rocket League or what Anthem was trying to be or whatever. Those things, it's weird, the actual function of a story in those games. It depends on kind of what the future of the industry wants to be. I think Sony are pushing back against that more than ever.
Definitely.
But it depends what they get used for.
Yeah, and I do think those are the exceptions. They're the exact exceptions I actually wrote down. A lot of Sony's output, whether it's Spider-Man or The Last of Us or God of War or Uncharted, and then you got Red Dead and of course the indie scene. But this might sound, not conducive to the argument I'm making, but I've rarely got into a game this year or even last or the year before and been surprised by a story. When I go into a Sony game, I go in mostly for the story and I know it's going to be good. Whereas I haven't really been pleasantly surprised by, say, the likes of Far Cry 5 or Metro Exodus even. Yeah,
and plus when you're on about Control, that idea that sort of mythology and world building, that can sort of supplant storytelling. For me, in Control's case, I adore Control. I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the best games of the year, but its story is terrible. If you actually sort of go beat by beat, what actually happens in this story, not talking about narrative necessarily, not talking about narrative world building and how believable that sort of scenario is and what Jesse goes through in terms of being a person in that world and all the different things that you can find out, like you said, all the documents and everything. If you actually just laid up the plot points, very little happens in that game and then it just ends. Which they're going to do DLC, they're going to sort of plug stuff back into it, and they do have a really good gameplay framework for it. But I'm not really coming away from it like I did from God of War, going oh my god, that moment, that revelation, that character.
I think Control is such a good example of this kind of phenomenon, because when I was playing through that, especially the early hours, and you were unlocking the secrets of the oldest house, and you were wondering what the Federal Bureau of Control were actually up to, it all promised so much, and I feel like you had to really delve into the background of the narrative to really, scratch the itch of the weirdness and make it work. Whereas the actual narrative itself, like you said, didn't really draw on those ideas and push them forward in interesting ways. The story itself was kind of predictable and rote in a way that it shouldn't have been at all, because it was such a weird game. It has a goddamn music video in it, and it's just absolutely outrageous. But I realized my favorite parts of the Control story were outside of the story, and I felt that a lot this year. My favorite parts of Metro Exodus, which I keep mentioning, were the stories I stumbled upon and the fleshing out of the world I was in, rather than what was actually happening to my character and the journey they were on. That kind of seemed secondary, because at the point we're in now, when sandbox games and games as service games are so prevalent, I feel like the player's story and the main character story are often one and the same, and you have to synergize them in a way that kind of potentially limits the personalization of the storytelling itself, and you have to become more of a conduit for things happening around you than things happening to you.
Yeah, well, it's that weird sort of shift where like across the 2000s you had like obviously the influx of like 3D became HD and whatever, and like I remember I did like a whole editorial on this. I think we made a video out of it. It was a while ago, but like that whole idea of like maybe storytelling in games was kind of just like an experiment. It was just like as 3D became HD and we started replicating like Hollywood cinematography styles and shooting cutscenes like movies and everything. Like how much is that completely anathema to the arcade and just playing for a certain section of time? The way that the casual market is sort of like played to, or the way that most people approach games who don't spend the amount of time playing them that we do, where they maybe check in for an hour a night, your FIFAs, your Call of Duties, the more mainstream stuff. That idea that you only need a set of mechanics, that's what the video game medium is. And storytelling and caring about why you're punching a thing in the face or shooting something, that was just this weird flirtation we had across the 2000s. I don't believe that, but I think there is evidence to say that, especially if you look at the decades that came before it and how heavy we were on arcade stuff and simple sets of mechanics and gameplay, and how much gameplay can trump story. Like that's why Control is so brilliant, because gameplay trumps story. The story in that game is not the recommendable.
I would agree with the bulk of what you just said there, to be honest, because I think especially over the past few years, the idea of the gameplay loop sort of reigns supreme. The fact that you can jump into a game for an hour a night or something and then go through this gameplay loop and feel rewarded, that's taken the focus, for me anyway, over story and narrative. Because back in the day when we used to have like linear 8-hour to 10-hour focused video games back in the late 2000s, the reward for the gameplay was often a cutscene, whereas now I don't think we have that same structure of gameplay cutscene. Now the reward for gameplay is maybe better loot, or it's a nice little document at the end of an area that fleshes out the world. It's not the narrative at hand. I just think the structure of video games now, especially when we go into more free-form games, even games that used to be linear now embrace free-form kind of wide linear elements. I feel like the structure of storytelling is kind of inherently limited. You look at games like, we've been playing Gears 5, and for me that game's story starts so well. In the minute you kind of go open world with it, you lose the urgency, you lose a lot of you lose a lot of like the precision that the storytelling had before then. You look at games like Mafia 3, which kind of starts off so well, and once it starts putting you in the gameplay loop of doing the same missions kind of like over and over again, completing X amount of activities before you unlock the next story thread, the pacing just crashes to a halt. And the structure of the storytelling is again limited by what you have to do kind of to get there. For me, Far Cry 5 is another example of this as well. I really like the setting. Again, I like the world, I like the mythology. I even like the bad guys you're facing up against. But because you can attack that game in more or less any way you want. You have the entire open world and you have your lieutenants to take down. There's no kind of inherent sense of escalation or kind of structure to it. You are doing sort of the same things, and the game can't really flex its storytelling muscles because it has to accommodate what the player is doing and kind of how it's chosen to present its story.
Which like ties into all that stuff that came out of GTA 4 about ludonarrative dissonance and how can an open world game even tell a really good story, because it's like, again, with the whole anathema like opposite ends type thing, it's like you have a whole set of gameplay mechanics that you want the player to indulge in, but also you're trying to tell a story, which stories inherently have 3-act structures, or at least they do if you're trying to go towards some sort of satisfying finale or takeaway moment or whatever. You're then kind of asking the player to sort of pick and choose the narrative moments or the storytelling moments alongside the gameplay stuff, and sometimes those things very rarely match up. The only game that I can think of that is like humongous in scale but also tells a great story is like The Witcher 3. And as much as I love the lore in Elder Scrolls and things like that, there are things that you have to go looking for, like you said, which like it's a weird split, because I don't think, this is pure speculation, but based on what I said before about like the way that the sort of trends felt like they were evident in the 2000s, I think think back then more companies were pitching stories and characters and like an enclosed story, whereas like once you had digital platforms in the generation as it is now, you can pitch a whole potential franchise. Like this mechanic will get played for 300 hours, and then we'll plug this bit in, and we'll slowly unfurl the entire story. Hence something like Anthem led with its gameplay mechanics and sort of gave you very little in terms of a story thing. That game ends, the post-credit scene is the sort of narrative pull or the storytelling pull for the future of that entire world, but you get that at the very end.
Yeah.
And so it's like I think we've come kind of full circle, and I think a lot of the big corporate and the AAA companies are realizing that they can sell gameplay more than story. And something like God of War, Red Dead, they're more like the anomaly. The vast majority of what makes the most money, and even something like Anthem made $100 million, which sucks, is that they're realizing that people want the gameplay.
Definitely,
the Divisions, the Ubisoft games, like whatever.
And I think that does come at the sort of, sacrifice of maybe not like a great story, but certainly a contained, cohesive story. Like you said, a game like Anthem is supposed to be this game as a service thing where story is plugged in and you experience it almost like a comic book or a TV show. And I think that's kind of the biggest change. But back in the day, games used to sort of emulate
10 years
movies. Back when I was 5, games used to emulate movies more than they did any other medium. But now I think when it comes to storytelling cues, it's more closely tied to comics or TV with this kind of, ever-evolving narrative that doesn't have a potential end point in sight, or we've just kind of come to understand as gamers that things will never be complete. Even when you get to something like Gears 4, that's the first part of a franchise. And Gears 4 very much feels like the first act to a larger sort of whole. I would never go back to play Gears 4 for its story as a self-contained thing. I would go back and play it as part of, the journey towards 5 and then eventually 6. And even Gears 5 to an extent feels like a middle chapter. It doesn't feel complete by the end of it. You feel like, there is still more to come and that you're not getting the whole picture. And I guess that sounds stupid, Josh. Of course you're not gonna get the whole picture when it's part of a franchise, but what I mean is, even in isolation, the story threads there, it doesn't. It's to be continued. The threads aren't, started and ended in that game to be picked up and evolved further. It's one long thread that's teased out.
Because it's a huge financial risk to close off your story. Like you never know when sequels might be coming back around, especially if they're trying to establish a platform of content or whatever. Like every major publisher wants you to play that game forever, and they obviously want to monetize things and put different sort of methodologies in place to do that. One of the only examples of a high-profile game that completely answered everything, left one thing on the table for a sequel, was Horizon Zero Dawn. By the end of that game, like 99% of the biggest questions you had in that game were completely answered, like fully, like both in terms of full-on storytelling sequences, like expository sequences, like this is why this happened, became this, Metal Gear style of like this is exactly what happened, plus a whole bunch of collectibles if you want to flesh out some other stuff, and they leave one thread dangling that they're assuming they're going to pick up in the sequel that I think they go back to after the credits, which I had actually forgot that was even a thing. Like at that point, it's the whole thing with Hades, not to do too specifically.
Okay, yes.
But they go back to this thing, and it's just sort of like, oh yeah, like I guess we'll get to that. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess, like sure. I was so satisfied by the way that game went, and it's just like that showed a level of confidence on behalf of Guerrilla that they were just like, nah, we'll go back and pull at some threads if we need to, but whatever. And that's like it's a weird sort of balancing of the books on the financial side as to like you don't want to sell the entire, get the story out the way altogether because you can monetize this thing later.
Well, that's it. Horizon is a great shout because it is such an anomaly, like you said. I have no idea how the hell they're going to make a sequel to that game. I'm sure it'll be great, but like you said, they concluded so many of the mysteries that they started at the beginning. And I think just that's kind of like in opposition to these big AAA games at the moment. Like we said at the beginning, Sony obviously doing great work in the indie sphere. Mechanics and story are so well synergized in a way that I don't think you get in like the big blockbuster releases. But for me, it all just kind of points towards a shift from storytelling to mythology, because partly I think that's easier to control and put in a big sort of wide open game. Even if it's sort of wide linear, it's easier to focus on mythology rather than manipulate gameplay structure and control the player's actions in a way that gives you that structured story.
I wonder how much they think that they're ticking the boxes of both sides, because you get the immediacy of the gameplay and the mechanics that are really good. You get that great first level, the whole opening 20 minutes, the whole rule of the opening 20 minutes type thing. You get all that stuff, But for all of us like hardcore hashtag nerds that are going to go out there and want to know why these things are happening, something like Control as an example, or like Gears or whatever, you get that immediate sort of sense of controlling the game. It feels very satisfying. It works. Someone's going to think that they've, it's worthwhile putting the money down on the game, and they get to walk away going, oh yeah, I had fun shooting a bunch of stuff. But they also get to tick the box of the super nerdy side, the origins of gaming, the whole, that idea that we're one of the most rabid fandoms there are of any sort of medium, because we can go looking for these additional like lore components and whatever else, and they kind of get to tick both boxes. But at no point, well, very rarely are those things unified within an overall storyline.
No,
There's only a handful of games that you can. Well,
maybe that you've touched on a point that I didn't actually think about, but maybe it's just because maybe these developers are just answering, a desire from gamers and players to, really explore the minutiae of lore and mythology. We've seen games like Dark Souls, and yes, I almost went a video without talking about Dark Souls, a video game video. But even like games like Dark Souls showed how mythology drives a community to interact and to explore a gaming world in such depth and detail. And maybe these games are just a kind of reaction to that. Maybe we don't want storytelling. Maybe we want worlds and lore that we can dig in and pick apart and debate.
I don't think that it's an accident it's. I think it's definitely like not a coincidence or whatever, that all of these things, all of these sort of general talking points, the idea of the impetus put on mythologies and lore and world building is right alongside the MCU and shared universes and the prevalence of all those things of getting lost in an entire mythology.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the bigger companies are just saying, well, here's an entire world for you to get lost in. Something like Gears 5 again, like is the first one of those games to have open world segments, but also loads it with documents and things to find. And there's so many new nouns and terminologies and stuff in that game to be like, here is the world. Like those things were in the books beforehand, like for the most part, but like there's a lot of stuff in Gears 5 that's sort of telling you like, this is a whole world.
Yeah.
Go get lost in this open space.
Well, I think a game like the original Destiny really sort of did that to a fault, where it relied on people caring about the mythology in favor of actually telling a compelling story, because it threw all these nouns at you and all of these sort of weird adjectives. And just sort of gave you that information and then expected the community to, attach to it and really dig in and become engaged with it. I don't think it quite worked how Bungie wanted, and obviously there was a huge internal problem with that, the development of that game, and how the story itself was scrapped 6 months or so before the game came out. But still, I feel like the fact that it came out and relied so heavily on this mythology is emblematic of potentially a push from the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and plus, like, it totally like worked in that game's case, because people like that. There was that whole statistic of the average Destiny player's hour count playing that game was 500. Like, if people are sticking around on Destiny, they're playing it for a hell of a lot. And there are loads of lore write-ups for that game too. But I think all of it boils down to a question of motivation. Like, why are you doing the thing that you're doing? And I never used to care about that stuff too much, and it depends on the game. Like, I was never sitting there playing Super Mario Brothers just like, well, why is he getting coins? Is he like, does he want money? Like, blah. Like, you never cared about that stuff. BioShock blew the doors right off that with the whole would you kindly thing, and sort of like letting all of us reinvestigate why we care about what we're doing in games. And I think a lot of the larger projects, a lot of the bigger companies, they don't care, and they know that the vast majority of players don't care. Here's a set of mechanics, they're fun to use.
That's it. Do them. And that comes back to my weird sort of, oxymoron question at the beginning, where I was saying I'm not surprised by games with that should have great stories when that's not the focus of them. Like, I go to Sony games for the story. I don't go for potentially, a game like even The Division for its story. And yet, the fact that they still have a story, though, it sort of invites this criticism. If you're not going to fully commit to it and go for it and try to tell something interesting and unique, then don't just kind of throw it in just for the sake of having one. It's potentially better to just sack it off and then focus fully on the mechanics. I don't know.
I would say so. I mean, that's one of the questions that we'll like hand over to you in the comments, is like that sort of general purpose of a story and motivation in games. Do you feel like you need it, or do you feel like the mechanics can sort of carry you through by themselves? And when have you ever sort of sat back and gone, I don't actually know why I'm doing this, but I don't know if I'm still having fun with it. But yeah, let us know what you think down in the comments below. Do you feel like stories serve video games, or video games serve stories? Let us know what you think. For now, though, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
I'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.